The armature is like a skeleton. I make mine in such a way that they can be moved, letting you make a posable art doll or even simple stop motion animation puppet. Greetings and welcome to the Dream Syndicate. If you want to join me in making an imaginary reality, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Now, let's get crafting. To make this armature, it's pretty important to have aluminum armature wire. We'll also need pliers, wire cutters, plumber's epoxy, resin epoxy, a measuring tape, ruler, Sharpie, and a stiffer wire like this steel wire. I'll put links to all the materials I'm using in the description and pinned comment. First, I have a sketch that's going to be the scale I want to build my character. It's helpful to have sketches to work off of so you can get a feel for whether you're going to like the look of your finished character, rather than spending a lot of time on a build that you're not going to be thrilled with. I designed the look of the character more in depth than other sketches, but this sketch is really just to get the proportions of the art doll right. After sculpting the head, I realized the character is going to be a little larger than I had initially planned. At this point, I could have scrapped the sculpt to get closer to the original plan, or modify it and just make him a little bigger. I went with making him bigger because I thought the sculpt came out really cool, and I already spent a lot of time on him. So our build goes from being around 10.5 inches to around 11 inches tall. We'll take a measure of the armature wire for his torso. It's going to go up into his neck, and the wire is going to get braided together, so we'll need more than double this measurement. For polymer clay characters with this thin of a neck, I sculpt the head over a bit of aluminum tubing the wire is going to slide into to attach the head. When I do this, I'll wrap a thin layer of paper tape around the wire to bulk it out and create friction so that the head doesn't just spin around on the wire. If it were a thicker necked character, you could just drill a hole into the center of the neck to hold the wire. Now we'll twist up some wire and use a Sharpie to mark off about where his chest is going to begin. For this character and most around his size, I usually use 16 gauge wire for the arms and 14 to 16 for the torso and legs. The higher the numerical number on the gauge, the thinner the wire is going to be. Then we can see how long the arm is. Measure a length of wire that's a little longer than twice that length and twist it up. And we'll just wrap it around our torso wire and cinch it down with our pliers. We'll take a second to see how it compares to our sketch. So far, so good. Here we have some denser steel wire that's going to be a little longer than the length of the legs. It looks like we've got the length about right for the legs. Once you get this technique down, you'll probably be able to build one of these armatures in around a half hour. We're going to make the length of the leg wires extra long, and you'll see why in just a moment. We'll go ahead and twist those wires together, but we're also leaving a loop on the end. This is going to help determine the shape of the character's foot. If you want your character to have little, petite feet, you'd make this loop on the smaller and narrower side. And if you wanted them to have big old stampy feet, you'd make the loop bigger and broader. We're going to run our steel wire through where the heel of the foot would be. The excess steel wire gives you a sturdy support that you can use to attach your art doll to a display base. Now we'll wrap the aluminum around the steel wire. I've straightened out the steel wire a bit to make this easier, but I left a bend where the hip falls. We'll stop when we get to the hip bend and do our best to match this up on the other leg. Next we'll take our torso piece and wrap the end of one and then the other leg wire around it. If we had made the bottom of the torso wire too long, we might have wound it around the steel wire or double back on itself. If the arm wire is left kind of loose, you can play around with the final location of it before we fix everything into place. Here we're going to mix up a lot of plumber's epoxy. It sets in 5 minutes, so we have to get it mixed and in place fast. On the sketch you can see the rounded rectangle of the chest, sort of mimicking the rib cage, and the smaller one of the pelvis. We're going to make those shapes with the plumber's epoxy. When you're first using it, you might want to do the torso and the pelvis separately so you don't feel like you're diffusing a bomb while you're trying to get the shapes right. If I'd used too much plumber's epoxy, I would have just pulled off the extra. While you may have 5 minutes of working time with this stuff, as it gets closer to the 5-minute mark, it heats up and gets progressively harder to get off your fingers the closer you get to that time limit. So I'd advise working a couple of minutes ahead of the set time, and setting aside your armature in such a way that the plumber's epoxy isn't touching any other surfaces. You can hold it up with a pair of helping hands, have a piece of wood you sink the excess steel wire into, or just lean the neck wire against something. It'll be ready to handle in about an hour. We'll just quickly snip off the excess wire for the neck and gently press the head on. What this is going to do is help shape the top of the chest against the inside of the art doll's neck for a better fit. And now we have our armature mostly done, and we can see how well it fits against our full scale sketch. We still want to bulk out the body a bit, creating some mass that's also lightweight. I like to use upholstery foam to do this, but other materials can be used such as cotton batting. When using upholstery foam, it's best to follow the natural bias of the material, meaning if it wants to curve a certain way, use it in a way that follows that curve. You can see the many body shapes I've already cut from this piece. My only problem is that I've got this weird bit of extra material I don't want to waste in the middle, so I'm going to ignore my best practice advice in favor of using it up. Using measurements from the art doll's torso, we'll sketch that onto the upholstery foam, and since there's a slight difference between the form of the front and back, we'll mark the front with an F. We'll do the same with the back, though making it a little broader and marking it with a B. If you use techniques you learned from any of my videos, I'd be happy to take a look. You can tag me wherever you're posting to. You can find my links below. Then we'll just take a regular pair of arts and crafts scissors and cut the piece out. I try to cut in such a way that the edge of the cut is roughly a 45-degree angle, but I don't drive myself nuts about being perfect. You can create an outline of where the torso and the pelvis block contacts the foam. This will give you a better idea of where to put your adhesive later. There's plenty of adhesives you can use, but I've always used 2-part resin epoxy. This is another thing that sets in 5 minutes. I like to use popsicle sticks to mix it up and use the same one like 15-20 times, as you can see from the build-up dried resin here. I've had this long enough that the resin part of the compound doesn't want to come out of the nozzle, so I'll use a toothpick to scrape some out. And then we'll spread out an equal amount of the yellowish hardener. We'll get this thoroughly mixed up and spread it on the surface of the torso and pelvic block. You can either generously apply the resin to the plumber's epoxy, or you can just put a bit on both surfaces, the plumber's epoxy and the upholstery foam pieces. We'll sandwich the armature build between the front and back pieces of foam. Make sure we like the placement. Then you can put a little weight on the foam as it sets, or you can wrap it in one of those ace bandages. You want to create firm pressure, but you don't want it squeezed so tight that it'll deform the foam, or as it defoam the form. Anywho, you want to let it sit overnight or an hour at the very least. We've left our character to set, and now we can refine the body shape. We use a tiny pair of scissors, like cuticle scissors, and trim little bits of foam away at a time. You really want to take your time on this part, because if you trim too much away, you might need to rip the piece of foam off and make a new one. If you go slow and steady instead, and stop and look at the shape as you go, you're much more likely to only have to do this part once. You just want to snip it in such a way that you get these sort of flat slopes, going in a little tighter around the lower back since the form tends to lean out there. After it's trimmed, you'll be able to buy or make whatever clothing you want your character to be wearing. Next, we'll find where you want his elbow joints to fall. Your elbows usually fall about halfway down your body, in line with your belly button, and we'll kind of keep that in mind for this build. Then we'll measure a piece of aluminum tubing that we'll use to make his forearms and cut it with a pipe cutter. I'll put links to where you can see how I make posable hands for art dolls that can also be lightly stop-motion animated. Now we'll figure out where to trim the excess arm wires. You want to leave a fair bit of length for it to anchor into the hands. And that will give you a functional, posable armature. Then you can use plumber's epoxy or epoxy sculpt to create footwear for your character, whether it's something that looks like shoes or boots. You can tinker with the shapes and proportions of it, but this is the basic idea of how to build a fast and inexpensive wire armature. Click the top video if you want to see how I make posable hands, and the second video to see another art doll build. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to join me in making the imaginary reality, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, make believe!